Story 1. The Gardens of Persepolis. Fragrance of a Lost Empire. The Scented Stones of Persepolis. You stand before the ruins of Persepolis, where wind and silence weave through fallen columns and fragments of stone that once glistened in the desert light. The air is dry, but if you close your eyes, you might still sense a faint sweetness, imagined or real, carried on the memory of cedar oil, myrrh, and rosewater. The scent, like the empire itself, has long since vanished. Yet for nearly 2 centuries, this place defined the very smell of power. The ancient Persians did not separate beauty from governance. The Achaemenid kings Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes believed that fragrance had divine origin. In their world, scent was not merely decoration or vanity. It was order made tangible, the invisible mark of civilization. The great king's halls were perfumed as carefully as his decrees were worded. The air of Persepolis itself was designed to remind all who entered that they stood within a sacred geometry of both scent and sovereignty. The first Greek visitors, accustomed to olive oil and the sharpness of wine, wrote with amazement of the perfumed courtyards of Persia. Xenophon described servants carrying censers that filled the great halls with clouds of incense during feasts. Herodotus mentioned rooms where the air itself seemed to glow with fragrance. Though their words carried suspicion, Greeks often mocked Persian luxury, they also betrayed awe. No empire had ever attempted to perfume itself into permanence. To understand why, one must first imagine the structure of Persepolis. Built under Darius I around 518 BCE, the city was more ceremonial than practical. It was not meant to be lived in year-round. It was a stage for the empire's rituals, a scented performance of order and devotion. The king would hold his New Year's festival here, receiving delegations from across his vast lands: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians. Each brought tribute, and among gold and textiles came the most precious offerings of all: fragrant resins, oils, and rare plants. The halls of Persepolis were thus a convergence point for the aromatic world. Arabia brought frankincense, India sandalwood, Egypt lotus oil, and from the Mediterranean came lavender and myrtle. In the ledgers of tribute etched in cuneiform, these were recorded not as luxuries, but as essentials, offerings to maintain harmony between man, nature, and divine fire. The scent of power was therefore literal. Royal attendants burned specific combinations of herbs and woods at dawn and dusk. Historians have found traces of aromatic residues in bronze burners discovered in the ruins, remnants of storax resin, possibly spikenard, and even cinnamon imported from Ceylon. Such imports were unimaginably expensive, yet the Persians believed their empire's spiritual health depended on them. Each fragrance corresponded to a virtue: cedar for endurance, myrrh for purity, rose for wisdom, and saffron for divine favor. The perfumed air of Persepolis had a hierarchy. The king's personal chambers received the rarest mixtures, thick oil infusions of galbanum and benzoin, while outer courtyards were perfumed by the wind-carrying smoke from communal censers. The very architecture aided this olfactory design. Vents carved in limestone walls directed airflows upward, dispersing scents evenly. Some archaeologists suggest that thin bronze trays once held oil lamps and incense, releasing fragrance through subtle heating. In essence, Persepolis was not only an architectural marvel, it was a giant perfume instrument, designed to control the air itself. This obsession with scent had roots deep in Persian spirituality. Zoroastrianism, the religion of the empire, placed immense symbolic power in the act of purification. Fire, as the embodiment of truth and divine light, had to be kept clean. Smoke from fragrant wood was considered the only acceptable companion to sacred flames. To offer incense was to feed the divine essence, to align oneself with the cosmic order. The use of pleasant aroma, therefore, was not sensual but sacred. To smell good was to live rightly. And yet, beyond religion, there was also politics. Darius understood that empire could not be maintained through military might alone. It had to be felt in the senses. Visitors to Persepolis were meant to be overwhelmed not by noise, but by silence, scent, and precision. Even the floor stones were polished to reflect lamplight softly, giving the illusion of walking on still water. Combined with the slow, rhythmic dispersal of incense smoke, the effect was hypnotic. Those who came to offer tribute often left believing that they had stepped briefly into a divine world. The artisans behind this sensory engineering were themselves unsung heroes of the empire. In administrative tablets found in Persepolis, workers known as aroma masters or carapans appear alongside metalworkers and scribes. They were paid in rations of wine, barley, and oil, sometimes even granted small plots of land. Their duties included distilling plant extracts, maintaining incense burners, and preparing scented unguents for ceremonies. They were also responsible for storing rare resins, some of which arrived hardened in clay jars sealed with wax and stamped with the royal emblem. These perfumers were part scientists, part priests, and their craft was guarded with secrecy. Recipes for royal perfumes were never written down but passed orally within families, from one generation to the next. In their quiet labor, these carapans preserved a subtle but powerful language. Each fragrance had a meaning, and to blend them incorrectly was more than error, it was blasphemy. The wrong scent could disturb the cosmic balance, offend the gods, or perhaps worst of all, insult the king. Thus, the perfumer's workshop was as sacred as any temple, its instruments as precise as those of an astronomer. When we imagine the hum of Persepolis at its height, we should think not only of drums and proclamations, but also of the low bubbling of oil in bronze cauldrons, the sound of grinding petals on stone, the whisper of smoke. Even the soldiers who guarded the palace bore the empire's scent. Records suggest that warriors of the immortals, the elite guard of the Achaemenid kings, carried pouches of aromatic herbs sewn into their tunics. It was believed the pleasant smell would protect them from corruption and decay, both physical and spiritual. When they marched, the air would stir with faint notes of myrtle and cinnamon, a moving aura of imperial dignity. The scent of the great king was, quite literally, carried wherever his soldiers went. But time is unkind to all that evaporates. The perfumes of Persepolis have long since faded into dust, leaving behind only silent stones. Archaeologists, kneeling among the ruins, find traces of burned resins in tiny fragments of ceramic. In these residues, modern science has begun to reconstruct the olfactory landscape of the empire, discovering that even in its ruins, the city still whispers through smell. Today, when tourists walk the terraces of Persepolis, they encounter only heat, wind, and silence. Yet perhaps, as the evening cools and the light softens, there is a moment brief and uncertain when the dry air carries something faint and strange. It might be imagination, or it might be memory. A hint of saffron, a trace of rose, the ghost of a vanished empire reminding you that power once had a scent. And as the stars rise over the black stone of the Apadana Hall, a question lingers like fragrance in the night air. What did it mean, truly, to perfume an empire? The scent of empire did not arise from temples or thrones alone. It was cultivated patiently, deliberately, and often invisibly by the hands of gardeners, herbalists, and botanists who toiled in the carefully planned expanses surrounding Persepolis. The grandeur of the palace was mirrored by what lay just beyond its gates, the royal gardens, or paradisa, from which we derive the very word paradise. If you had walked through one of these gardens during the reign of Darius the Great, you might have first heard the gentle trickle of artificial streams, designed to cool the air and irrigate neatly arranged flower beds. Water was a divine gift in the arid Iranian plateau, and the Persians revered its movement as sacred. In the gardens of Persepolis, the Achaemenid kings displayed their control not only over nature, but over time itself, forcing blooming cycles to align with rituals and imperial visits. The paradisa was more than a place of beauty. It was a laboratory of scent. Here, the empire's perfumed future was grown leaf by leaf, flower by flower. Saffron crocuses bloomed in low, neat rows, their fragile stigmas hand-harvested at dawn by women and children trained in silence and care. Damask roses cultivated for both oil and water extraction were shaded by olive trees and pruned to produce the most fragrant blossoms. Aromatic shrubs like marjoram, mint, and basil lined the paths, releasing bursts of smell with each passing breeze. But these were not wild arrangements. Everything in the garden was catalogued, observed, and optimized. In clay tablets recovered from the Persepolis archives, lists appear detailing seeds received from as far as Nubia and India. The gardeners recorded growth rates, flowering times, and even fragrance profiles. Strong and sharp, not suitable for burning, or sweet with cooling effect, reserved for inner sanctum use. Some plants were grown not for their smell, but for the oils they produced when pressed. Almonds, sesame, and flax were harvested seasonally, their oils later infused with the flowers grown nearby. Scent, in this context, was a matter of agricultural precision. The king's personal botanist, a title we know from fragmentary Elamite records, was responsible not only for maintaining the gardens, but for expanding their influence across the empire. When a new satrap was appointed in Egypt, for example, a collection of garden instructions often accompanied him. Suggested layouts, irrigation advice, and seeds for plants known to please the king's palate and nose. These imperial garden packets were as much a diplomatic tool as a horticultural one. From this practice, the empire grew not just politically, but sensorially. A traveler could move from Sardis in western Anatolia to the shores of the Indus River and still find patches of rose and cypress, arranged in familiar patterns. In effect, the Persian paradisa became a language and imperial dialect of scent, shape, and water. The smell of mint at sunset, the bloom of narcissus before Nowruz, the bitter oil of hyssop rubbed into the skin before prayers, all of these became part of what it meant to live under Achaemenid rule. But the gardens also served deeper purposes. In spring, when the king returned to Persepolis for the New Year festival, the gardens were transformed into arenas of philosophical and religious ritual. Zoroastrian priests, or magi, walked the pathways reciting the Gathas, the sacred hymns attributed to the prophet Zoroaster. As they chanted, attendants poured rosewater onto the stone tiles, a symbolic act of cleansing both the earth and the air. The connection between cleanliness, scent, and virtue was never far from the surface. One particular ritual reconstructed from fragments found in Babylon and Persepolis describes a scented procession in which noble families walked the garden paths carrying pouches of dried herbs. These were burned at specific junctures, marking the four cardinal directions and invoking the spirits of water, fire, earth, and sky. The precise blend of herbs used in each pouch was determined by the priesthood and aligned with astrological calendars. Even in their most mundane acts, the Persians attempted to align the earthly with the cosmic. Children of the nobility were also educated in these gardens. In their early years, they were taught to identify plants by touch and smell before they were ever taught to write. To recognize saffron before you recognize your own name, such was the proverb noted by a later Greek visitor. This education was not sentimental. Knowing which plants healed, which cleansed, which honored the gods, and which offended them was a matter of survival, status, and duty. Interestingly, the Persian method of plant classification focused on sensation rather than form. In contrast to the Greek emphasis on visual observation, petal count, color, leaf shape, the Persians recorded plants by their scent, their oil content, their behavior under heat or sun, and their spiritual effects. This sensory-first approach produced a unique form of botanical knowledge, one that influenced later Islamic scholars and perfumers during the Abbasid period. Trade, too, was organized through these gardens. Ambassadors sent from Persepolis were often accompanied not by soldiers, but by gardeners and perfumers. These emissaries of scent carried with them tiny wooden boxes filled with dried blossoms, oils, and resins. A small gift of Persian saffron, wrapped in silk and offered with silence, could secure more trust than a dozen eloquent speeches. It is no coincidence that the Greek word aroma came into common use during this period. Yet not all scents were welcome. The Persians had an elaborate theory of foulness of corruption through smell. Rotting food, unwashed bodies, spoiled oil, and poorly mixed incense were considered signs of moral decay. There are records of servants being punished not for theft, but for allowing a ceremonial room to carry the scent of stagnation. The olfactory order of the empire was fragile, easily disturbed. A bad smell, like a bad omen, could be taken as a warning of divine disfavor. This explains the strict hygiene maintained in and around the palace complex. Servants bathed daily in perfumed water. Storage rooms for aromatic substances were sealed with pitch and clay, each marked with the date of last inspection. Gardens were swept and pruned with the same attention given to scrolls or weapons. Even composting was a carefully regulated act, hidden from ceremonial areas and supervised by low-level scribes tasked with maintaining balance in the earth. One of the most fascinating and often overlooked features of the Persepolis complex is a small structure to the northeast of the central hall, believed by some archaeologists to be an olfactory library. Though its walls have largely collapsed, excavations in the 1930s uncovered shelves carved directly into the limestone, and several dozen small jars labeled with Elamite and Old Persian inscriptions. These jars contained hardened resins, dried petals, and lumps of what may have been early pomades. The inscriptions noted the plant's origin, its preparation method, and its ceremonial use. A few entries even suggest the recommended emotional state for using each scent: for grief, for clarity, for strength before battle. Who curated this space? Perhaps it was the chief carapan, or a priest, or perhaps it was a queen. In some later inscriptions, royal women are associated with scent-making, particularly in the use of rosewater and saffron oil. These women would not have been mere consumers of perfume, they were often its creators and curators. To wield scent was to wield influence, and to influence the court's sensory world was to shape the very language of power. As the sun sets behind the Zagros Mountains and the stone of Persepolis begins to cool, the scents that once hovered over its stones dissipate again into history. The gardens are long gone, buried beneath centuries of dust and erosion. But seeds, when buried, do not always die. In 2012, Iranian archaeologists near Shiraz uncovered fragments of ceramic planters near what they believe was one of the outer paradisa walls. Inside, preserved by dryness and time, were the carbonized remains of damask rose roots, ancestors of a plant still grown in the same region today. The scent, faint but present, rose again into the open air for the first time in over 2,000 years. And so we are left to ask, what secrets did these ancient gardens still hold, waiting quietly beneath the soil? By the early 4th century BCE, the scent of Persepolis had begun to fade, not in its gardens or its rituals, but in the larger currents of empire. The air still carried the smell of saffron and cedarwood, but the rituals had grown repetitive, the records more cautious, the tributes less abundant. Even scents, it seemed, could grow tired. The once impeccable order of the Achaemenid court began to fray in the smallest, most telling ways. Scribes recorded delays in the arrival of incense shipments from the Arabian Peninsula. Temple burners required repair more frequently. Clay tablets note that the last rose distillations were thinner than desired, and that the perfume intended for the king's use during Nowruz was deemed inadequate. These were not catastrophes, not yet, but they were signs. Empires, like gardens, decay not from a single blow, but from slow neglect. Yet still the rituals continued. Smoke curled through the air during festivals. The king, now Artaxerxes III, would walk through the remains of the great garden paths flanked by priests and nobles, the air carefully scented to mask the growing weight of political tension. The satrapies murmured. Egypt resisted taxation. The Greeks, always restive, sensed opportunity. And then came the boy from Macedon. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into Persian territory in 334 BCE, he did not march with the scent of frankincense or myrrh. He brought instead the acrid tang of iron, sweat, and war. By the time he reached Persepolis in 330 BCE, the empire that had once perfumed itself into order stood exposed and brittle. The city, designed as a ceremonial jewel rather than a fortress, was taken with relative ease. The accounts of what happened next vary in tone and in purpose. Some ancient sources say Alexander was welcomed as a liberator, others that he looted Persepolis in a drunken frenzy. What they all agree on, however, is that he set the palace ablaze, whether out of revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens, or as a symbolic cleansing of empire. The fire that consumed Persepolis was both literal and ceremonial. But before he did, he paused. Ancient sources such as Plutarch and Arrian tell us that Alexander walked the halls of Persepolis, observing its reliefs, its empty thrones, and most intriguingly its storerooms of aromatic substances. He was reportedly fascinated by the scent jars, the unguents, and the incense. There's a quiet line in Arrian's Anabasis noting that Alexander kept a collection of Persian perfumes with him on later campaigns. It's possible that even in destruction, he recognized the power of smell, its ability to evoke memory and control. When the fires began, it wasn't only scrolls and banners that burned. The fragrant heart of the empire went up in smoke. The incense stores, so carefully cataloged for generations, ignited like tinder. The oils, once kept cool in clay jars beneath the palace floors, vaporized into the night air. Witnesses describe the flames as strange and multicolored, likely due to the rich chemical cocktail of resins and essences. The final perfume of Persepolis was its funeral pyre. But there's an irony here, quiet and cruel. For a moment, Persepolis may have smelled more alive than it had in years. The intense release of scent into the air, myrrh, saffron, spikenard, cinnamon, and storax, must have created an overwhelming olfactory spectacle. A final offering. The city's last breath was fragrant. The ruins smoldered for days. When Alexander moved on, leaving behind ash and broken stone, the Persian Empire had ended not only politically, but sensorially. The scents that had once defined order, divine favor, and legitimacy were gone. Without their daily rituals and careful applications, they could not be sustained. The perfumed empire had no afterlife. Or did it? In the decades that followed, as Hellenistic rulers adopted and adapted Persian customs, the fragrance practices of the Achaemenid world lived on. In Alexandria and Antioch, scholars studied Persian perfume making. Zoroastrian exiles in Central Asia carried with them their sacred incense recipes, preserving a line of olfactory tradition that would later influence Sasanian and even Islamic perfumery. The notion that smell could be a language of order, ritual, and philosophy, that idea did not die in the flames. Fragments of the Carapan class, the priest-perfumers, appeared in later records in Bactria and Media. Some are named in temple inscriptions as those who prepare the air. One Babylonian tablet from a century after the fall of Persepolis mentions a man trained in the method of the Persian garden scent, hired to prepare incense for a royal wedding. Even the Greeks, once skeptical of Persian luxury, began to embrace scented oils not merely for personal use, but in civic rituals. Centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad would preserve Persian distillation methods. The father of modern chemistry, Jabir ibn Hayyan, developed improved alembics for extracting scent from flowers, citing older Persian techniques in his writings. Avicenna, born in Bukhara, once a part of the Persian cultural world, refined the steam distillation process to extract rosewater more effectively, a method still used today. And so, the scent of Persepolis lingered, not in air but in memory. In gardens replanted, in books rewritten, in oils still pressed and distilled, the empire endured in its most ephemeral form. Today, travelers who walk the ruins of Persepolis might bring rosewater with them, sprinkling it gently on the hot stones, reviving, if only symbolically, the vanished rituals. Historians crouched over excavation sites still find remnants, tiny bits of carbonized resin, traces of oil in ancient containers, botanical remains of saffron and damask rose. In these remains, the past whispers not with trumpets or declarations, but with scent, faint, fading, yet still there. And perhaps this is the final lesson of the gardens of Persepolis. that the most powerful legacies are not the ones carved in stone or chanted from thrones, but those that linger softly in the air unseen, ungraspable, and unforgettable. So when we ask what it meant to perfume an empire, we are really asking, can something invisible ever truly disappear? Story 2. Frankincense and Forgotten Roads, the Desert Caravans of Arabia. Imagine you are walking in silence beneath the blistering sun of southern Arabia, perhaps near Dhofar or along the slopes of the Kara Mountains. There is no wind, only the cry of distant birds and the rhythm of your footsteps on dry, stony ground. The terrain seems barren until your eyes adjust and you notice the trees gnarled and unassuming, their branches twisted like the hands of old men. These are Boswellia sacra, the frankincense trees, and from them flows the scent that once perfumed temples, embalmed kings, and bought the loyalty of empires. Frankincense does not declare itself. The tree looks plain. Its bark is dusty and pale, its leaves small and sparse. But if you cut it carefully, reverently, a milky resin will slowly begin to seep. The locals call it the tears. The first harvest yields the lowest quality, a sticky, cloudy mass with little fragrance. But when cut again, after time, the resin that hardens into pale golden drops is considered sacred. It is this hardened sap burned as incense, ground into oil, or chewed for health that carried Arabia's name into the courts of Babylon, Jerusalem, and Rome. The world has always had fragrances, but it was frankincense that first made them global. By 1000 BCE, long before the rise of Persepolis, the people of southern Arabia had already begun cultivating and trading this precious substance. The ancient kingdoms of Sheba, Hadramaut, and Kadhaban made their wealth not from gold or conquest, but from trees that bled slowly under the desert sun. These kingdoms, now buried beneath centuries of sand and obscurity, controlled one of the most important supply chains in antiquity, the incense road. Unlike the grand cities of the north, the incense trade was a product of silence, patience, and hardship. Caravans moved slowly 20, sometimes 30 camels at a time through the deserts of Arabia, up into the Levant, and toward the ports of Gaza and Petra. Some routes stretched over 2,000 kilometers, winding past oases, ancient wells, and tribal territories marked by stone cairns. Each leg of the journey required careful timing. Travel during the day was unbearable in summer. Sandstorms could bury entire groups. Camels were loaded at dawn with leather-wrapped bundles of frankincense resin, sometimes mixed with myrrh or precious spices like cardamom and cinnamon. At night, the merchants camped in circles, burning their own product not out of excess, but as part of tradition. To guard yourself by smoke, they believed, was to walk with divine favor. The smell of the caravan was unique. Leather, sweat, sun-baked dust, and beneath it all, the bittersweet scent of the resin itself. Not overpowering, never that, but lingering, a note of divinity in the air. What made frankincense valuable was not just its fragrance, but what that fragrance meant. In the ancient world, scent was spiritual geometry. To burn incense was to bridge heaven and earth. In temples across Mesopotamia, priests waved bronze censers not just to please the gods, but to create a sacred space, one where divine judgment might be softened by sweetness in the air. The Israelites used frankincense in the Holy of Holies. Egyptian embalmers rubbed it into the bandages of the dead. Greek philosophers believed it opened the mind to higher reason, and Roman emperors demanded it by the ton, believing that an empire without incense was an empire unblessed. This demand made the southern Arabian kingdoms into invisible empires of supply. They controlled no legions, but they controlled something far more enduring, a need deeply felt across cultures and religions. Yet the source of frankincense was carefully guarded. To outsiders, the trees were a mystery. Herodotus claimed they were protected by winged serpents. Pliny the Elder believed the trees grew in lands so holy that mere mortals dared not harvest them without rituals. These myths were not simply superstition, they were strategy. The peoples of Arabia, knowing the power of monopoly, shrouded their trade routes in secrecy. Still, the trade grew. By the 6th century BCE, frankincense caravans had become annual epics rituals in their own right. Each began near the coastal town of Sumhuram, modern-day Korwari, where ships from India unloaded spices and where Arabian traders loaded resin. From there, the camels wound north through the Wadi Hadramaut, then west into Najran, and finally along the incense trails toward Petra or the Red Sea. Each stop along the way had its own rhythm. At watering stations, merchants paid tribute to local tribes in order to pass safely. In certain shrines carved into rock, they left small offering shells, bits of silver, even pieces of their own product to ensure favorable passage. The trail was not a highway, but a ritual performance repeated year after year. The profits were vast. Resin sold for its weight in silver in Babylon and for even more in Rome. The kings of Arabia grew rich enough to build stone temples, commission inscriptions, and raise cities like Marib and Timna, many of which now lie abandoned, their carvings half buried in dust. But wealth is never silent for long. As frankincense demand exploded, so too did imperial interest. The Persians, during the Achaemenid era, attempted to establish indirect control over the incense routes through soft influence and alliances. They respected Arabia's autonomy in name, but not in strategy. Gifts of gold and marriage alliances were offered to incense kings. Sometimes veiled threats were made if supplies faltered. Later, Rome would go further. Under Augustus, Rome attempted to bypass the overland caravans entirely by sending fleets down the Red Sea to establish trade directly. They failed not due to military weakness, but due to nature and the stubborn endurance of Arabian traders. The land was too harsh, the routes too complex, the trees too elusive. Even today, those who cultivate frankincense will tell you that it takes years to learn the proper way to score a tree. The incisions must be angled, the depth precise. Cut too deep and the tree dies. Cut too shallow and no sap emerges. Patience, knowledge, and quiet, the very qualities that made the incense road thrive, also made it nearly impossible to steal or replicate. And yet, for all its wealth and reach, the story of Arabia's incense kingdoms remains half forgotten. Their cities fell slowly into disuse, their rituals eroded by time. When sea routes became dominant in the late Roman and early Islamic periods, the caravans began to dwindle. Fewer camels walked the incense road. The temples grew silent. The trees wept more slowly. But in the valleys of Dhofar, Boswellia sacra still grows. And in small villages, old men still teach their grandchildren how to wound the bark gently, how to wait, how to let the resin dry before collection. The ritual continues, quiet and unchanged. Walk through these places today and you'll still find incense burning not in temples but in homes, not for gods but for guests. It is used to bless newborns, to cleanse rooms before weddings, to mark the end of the day. In some ways, the trail never ended, it just moved inward, becoming a scent passed down, generation by generation. And so, a question rises like smoke from a slow-burning censer. How did these silent caravans shape the very idea of sacredness across the ancient world? The desert to the outsider appears empty, but look again. Along the long and shifting paths of the incense trade, there were once cities not grand in size perhaps, but rich in rhythm. Their wealth was not broadcast with gold, but with the faint, clinging perfume of their storage houses. These were the caravan cities: Petra, Man, Kadhaban, Ubar, and others now lost to time or buried beneath the drifting sands. Each served a purpose. Each stood not in defiance of the desert, but in partnership with it. As the caravans moved northward, they needed places to rest not only for the camels, but for the men and goods they carried. A fully loaded incense caravan might take 2 to 3 months to complete its journey, and rest stops became more than necessities. They became nodes of culture, exchange, and control. One of the most prominent of these cities was Shabwa, the capital of Hadramaut. Located at the meeting point of several incense routes, It housed not only storerooms and markets, but ritual spaces dedicated to the gods of incense and trade. Archaeologists have uncovered altars with soot-stained surfaces and ash layers rich in resin compounds, evidence of ceremonial burnings that likely marked the beginning and end of each caravan's departure. These weren't simple commercial events. A caravan leaving Shabwa was blessed, sung over, perfumed, and entrusted to the desert. Along the way, cities like Timna served as way stations where trade goods were taxed and repackaged. A portion of the incense was always set aside for local rulers or temples. Trade and worship were inseparable. Even secular transactions bore the scent of sacredness. The Nabateans, a people of Semitic origin based in the city of Petra, mastered the art of incense logistics. Petra, carved directly into rose-colored sandstone cliffs, was not merely a beautiful city, it was a masterclass in trade infrastructure. From its hidden cisterns that captured desert rainwater to its caravanserais and bustling markets, Petra was the final northern staging post for incense before it moved into the Levant and Mediterranean. Petra's rulers did not grow frankincense, but they taxed and controlled it. By the 1st century BCE, they had become fabulously wealthy enough to build monumental tombs, lavish public spaces, and an elite class of merchants whose authority rivaled that of local kings. Roman writers, seeing their success, wondered aloud how a people with no navy or legions could wield such influence. The answer, as always, was smoke. Nabatean control over trade routes gave them quiet but formidable leverage. Other cities were more ephemeral. Ubar, the so-called Atlantis of the Sands, appears in both archaeological records and Arabian folklore. Said to have collapsed into the earth as punishment for greed, Ubar was likely a transit hub where caravans refilled water skins and hired local guides before entering the harshest stretch of the Rub, Al-Khali, the empty quarter. Whether swallowed by sand or simply abandoned, Ubar remains a symbol of the fragility of wealth built on a single substance. And yet, all these cities shared a kind of invisible architecture. Their design was shaped around the flow of incense. The buildings often included perfume storage rooms, with double walls and underground pits to protect against heat. Covered courtyards, where bundles of resin were sorted and packaged. Prayer niches or incense altars, indicating how thoroughly this substance was woven into spiritual and commercial life. Small perfumers' shops, which sold local blends or diluted oils for everyday use, suggesting a middle class of scent, available to those who could not afford the purest grades. These cities, you could buy not only the raw resin but experience scent in layers. Travelers from far-off lands would stop to inhale unfamiliar aromas, Opipanax, labdanum, balm of Gilead. There were blends for weddings, others for funerals. Some perfumes were kept in sealed alabaster jars and labeled with inscriptions, for clarity in debate, to calm the body, or for divine favor in journeys. These cities were not only purveyors of materials, but of moods and states of being. But not all was serene. The wealth generated by incense attracted the envy of empires. The Romans in particular viewed Arabian control of the incense trade as an irritation, if not a direct threat. Around 25 BCE, the Roman general Aelius Gallus led a military expedition into Arabia Felix, modern Yemen, aiming to subdue the incense-producing regions. His campaign failed miserably. The Roman army, unprepared for the climate and betrayed by local guides, retreated in humiliation. This failure was more than military, it was philosophical. Rome could conquer people, but not arid knowledge. The roots, the trees, the harvesting techniques, the rituals, they were all local, guarded by generations of tradition and necessity. The Arabian trade networks were woven not only with camels and maps, but with trust, kinship, and secrets. Even so, Roman influence eventually seeped in. Roman coins appeared in caravan cities. Some Arabian temples began adopting Greco-Roman architectural motifs. Cultural exchange moved both ways. Resins went north, and with them came glassware, wine, and metallurgy. The cities adapted, but they never surrendered. Back at the source, the highlands of Dhofar and the plains near Shabwa, the trees continued to weep. Harvesting followed a rhythm older than kings. The first cut in early spring, a light wound. The second a few weeks later, yielding better resin. And the third in early summer, the best and clearest, called al-Hajari, prized above all. Resin collectors, known as mujema, lived in small groups and followed the same trails every year. They carried simple tools, curved knives, wicker baskets, leather pouches lined with linen. After collection, the resin was dried in shaded huts, sorted by color and size, and packed for trade. The work was monotonous, exacting, and deeply respected. At night, under open skies, they would burn a bit of the resin to honor the trees and the spirits they believed watched over the harvest. The rising smoke was both gratitude and signal, a call to those who remembered the old gods. Even today, frankincense harvesting remains almost unchanged. It is still performed by hand. The tools are the same. The roots are known only to a few, and in places like Salalah and Wadi Dhaka, the groves are still passed down in families, each one knowing its particular trees by name, age, and temperament. These traditions are fragile. Climate change, overharvesting, and declining prices have made the old ways harder to sustain. Young people leave for cities. The trade shrinks. But in the cracks of forgotten temples, in the soot of old incense burners, and in the stone inscriptions that say only, "For the smoke that pleases the gods," the memory holds. One wonders what it was like to live in a world where a single scent could summon faith, wealth, and power. And so, as we look across the desert today and see only sand, we must ask, what other cities of scent lie buried, waiting for their stories to be inhaled again? It is said that the last of the great incense caravans departed sometime in the early 3rd century CE, its route winding from the southern coast of Arabia through Marib, Timna, and Petra like so many before it. But the world it moved through had changed. The Roman Empire was now in crisis. Trade routes had shifted, and the Red Sea became busier than the desert. New seafaring technologies allowed merchants to bypass the long, punishing overland paths, sailing instead from ports in Egypt and Arabia directly to India and the Horn of Africa. The slow rhythm of the camel trains, once the backbone of the incense world, could no longer compete with ships that carried 10 times the cargo in a quarter of the time. The cities built by smoke began to empty. Shabwa faded. Kataban collapsed. Petra lost its edge. The gods once honored with clouds of resin fell silent. In some places, temples were repurposed as homes or storehouses. In others, they were simply abandoned, deserted, but never entirely erased. But the end was not abrupt. For generations, families continued the old routes, not as part of grand caravans, but as smaller bands trading within shrinking circles. Some cities turned inward, trading locally. Others reinvented themselves as religious centers. Yet the ancient knowledge of resin harvesting, of how to read the desert winds, of how to blend myrrh with balsam for funerary rites, persisted, just quieter. By the 7th century, with the rise of Islam, incense took on new significance. The Quran mentions frankincense obliquely, as part of the goods of Arabia. The Prophet Muhammad is said to have appreciated scent deeply and encouraged cleanliness and the burning of incense. Mosques began to adopt the practice of perfuming prayer spaces with frankincense and oud, and the knowledge of aroma, once pagan and sacred, was preserved in Islamic medicine and spiritual practice. In the markets of Mecca and Medina, resins from Dhofar and Somalia were sold alongside spices and dates. Traders still rode parts of the old incense road. The cultural memory of smoke remained, though now it belonged to a new order. Centuries later, European travelers, Marco Polo among them, wrote with awe of Arabian perfumes and the strange gum that burned with a clean white smoke and a holy scent. In the late Middle Ages, frankincense entered the Western world not through its old ritual use, but as part of Christian liturgy. Catholic cathedrals, particularly in Rome, Cologne, and Seville, adopted incense as a core part of Mass, the swinging thurible, releasing sweet clouds of frankincense into the vaulted air, became a visual and olfactory echo of temples long gone. What was once an Arabian rite became a universal symbol. Yet even as the world changed, some things remained. In Dhofar, where the Boswellia sacra trees still cling to rocky soil, the harvest continues each spring and summer. Men in sandals and headscarves approach the same trees that their ancestors marked with carved stones and whispered blessings. With a small curved blade, they nick the bark, just enough to wound it gently. The sap seeps, opaque and slow. They wait. Weeks pass and the tears harden into golden nodules. These are gathered by hand, sorted by color and clarity, and packed in linen for market. The skill is more than agricultural. It is part of identity. In some villages, it is still considered dishonorable to harvest resin from another family's trees. The roots to the best groves are shared only among kin. The drying racks are placed in shaded courtyards out of sight. Even now, the knowledge is not written down, it is told, shown, remembered. In the nearby port of Salalah, tourists now come seeking heritage. They buy packets of frankincense, still sticky with oil, or small burners made of clay. In gift shops, the language is modern: natural antiseptic, stress relief aromatherapy, historical fragrance. But speak to the older men in the mountains, and the words shift. They call it Lubin, a word older than empire, and they still believe it pleases God, guards against evil, and brings clarity to the heart. And that clarity has drawn more than tourists. Scientists and historians have begun retracing the incense road, using satellite imagery, ancient inscriptions, and ethnographic interviews to map a trade system that once stretched from Yemen to Byzantium. Excavations in once-forgotten cities reveal not just the walls and artifacts of the past, but ash layers in temples, botanical residues in pots, and fragments of censers, quiet evidence of smoke. Frankincense has even returned to medicine. Modern researchers are studying its potential anti-inflammatory properties, its use in traditional cancer remedies, and its role in psychological wellness. The resin of the Boswellia tree, it seems, has more to give. So what remains of the old trade? Not the power, not the cities, but the ritual, that moment when flame touches resin and smoke spirals upward. That act continues in churches, mosques, temples, and homes. And when the smoke rises, something ancient stirs in the mind, a recognition, a memory. Perhaps this is the secret of frankincense, that it teaches us to pause, to mark time not with noise but with scent. Because the true empire of smoke was never measured in coin or territory. It was measured in moments of prayer, of mourning, of welcome, of silence. Moments when the air changed, and so did we. In one final echo of the old days, an inscription carved into the sandstone outside Petra reads simply, "He who follows the smoke walks not alone." And so, as the sun sets over the high desert, and a small plume of resin rises from a clay bowl, we ask, what have we lost by forgetting to perfume the path we walk? Story 3. The Alchemists of Ecbatana. Perfume and Power in the Median Court. You arrive in a city of concentric circles, where each wall is painted a different color: white, black, red, blue, and finally the highest golden, shining in the morning light. This is Ecbatana, the capital of the ancient Median Empire, perched in the Zagros Mountains of northwestern Iran. Known to later Greek historians as a marvel of order and symmetry, Ecbatana was more than a city, it was a vision, both architectural and philosophical. Built centuries before the rise of Persepolis, Ecbatana belonged to a different kind of empire, one founded not through vast conquest, but through quiet control, strategic alliances, and rituals rooted deeply in the land. Its king, Cyaxares, had no navy, and his armies were smaller than those of Assyria or Babylon. But within the thick walls of his capital, a different power was cultivated, the power of transformation. At the heart of this power stood a small, secretive class of craftsmen and scholars known as the fragrance keepers of Ecbatana. They were not called alchemists at the time, no such word existed in the 7th century BCE, but their work had all the qualities of proto-chemistry. They distilled, boiled, fermented, and blended. They watched plants decay and oils clarify. Their instruments were rudimentary bronze alembics, stone mortars, fired clay retorts, but their knowledge was immense. These were the Tarkibgaran, the combiners, whose task was to create the perfumes of the royal court, the scented salves of the temples, and the aromatic potions of the priesthood. In an age before labeled glass bottles, before standardized methods, these men and women worked with instinct and observation, passing down their knowledge by hand, breath, and memory. Ecbatana's high altitude and cool climate made it ideal for storing delicate materials. Couriers brought raw ingredients from every direction: pine resin from the Caspian coast, rose petals from the plains of Media, spikenard from the mountains of Elam. Inside the palace complex, a specific quarter never directly named in written records, but hinted at in surviving inscriptions, was reserved for the blending of these elements. Greek historians would later speak of Median luxury as barbarian excess, but this was a misunderstanding. The Medes did not perfume for vanity. They perfumed for protection, for purity, and for politics. The fragrance of the Median king's robes was not random. It was carefully prepared each month to reflect the celestial calendar and the perceived humors of the body. One mixture, known from fragmentary records as galafton, combined damask rose, honey wine, and cedar oil heated gently, cooled in a shaded chamber, and applied sparingly to fabric. The resulting scent was said to calm dispute and ease the tongue, making it ideal for treaty meetings or moments of statecraft. Another Hamzabar combined crushed mint, goat's milk, and a rare red resin. It was reserved for funerary rites, burned only when members of the royal family passed into the next life. The smell was said to evoke the boundary between life and spirit, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but unforgettable. These blends were more than aromatic, they were instruments of governance. It was believed that certain scents could influence behavior, even the mind. The Tarkibgaran were expected to understand not only the properties of ingredients, but their effects on different classes of people. A scent for warriors would be harsh, sharp, based on myrrh, coriander, and burnt oak. One for the high priest would be subtle, dry, evoking clarity. And one for foreign guests might be floral and sweet, meant to suggest bounty and cultural richness. There were dangers, too. Some substances were considered volatile, spiritually or physically. The sap of certain mountain trees was avoided entirely, said to cause madness if burned indoors. Others, like sulfur-infused oils, were used only during eclipses, times when the god's sight was obscured, and the usual rules did not apply. The palace at Ecbatana was built with these beliefs in mind. Its audience chambers had high ceilings and narrow windows to direct airflow. Panels in the floors suggest that censers could be positioned strategically, allowing the air to be gently infused with specific perfumes during events. Visitors would never know they were being influenced, only that the room seemed calmer, brighter, or more solemn than expected. To the outside world, the Median Empire appeared modest. It lacked the monuments of Egypt, the ziggurats of Babylon, or the later splendor of Persepolis. But its power lay in the orchestration of experience. When neighboring kings entered the capital, they were met with stillness, with fragrance, with order. One Babylonian tablet describes a diplomatic visit in which the halls smelled of rose and thunder, likely a poetic reference to a blend of floral and earthy resins. Another Assyrian record mocks the Medes for smelling like gardens even in war. But this too suggests consistency, the kind of olfactory branding modern states might envy. Among the most mysterious records from Ecbatana are a series of herbal codices, discovered only partially in the late 19th century and now housed in Tehran's National Museum. Written in Old Median script, they describe rituals of blending that border on the mystical. Phrases such as "bind the scent before the moon wanes," or "heat the oil until it forgets the plant," indicate a language of alchemy not yet formalized. This was knowledge carried in metaphor, in ritualized practice, not in scientific terms. It's important to remember that the Medes, though often overshadowed by the later Achaemenids, established the cultural groundwork that Persia would later refine. Ecbatana was the first great Iranian capital, and its emphasis on sensory influence through sight, sound, and especially scent was inherited by Darius and Xerxes when they forged their greater empire. But what of the Tarkibgaran themselves? Their names are mostly lost. A few appear in trade tablets, Arash Vahuna Tarita. Their titles are cryptic: he who keeps the quiet fire, or she who counts the drops. From these fragments, it is clear that some were women, a rarity in the chemical arts of the time. The Median court, according to later Greek accounts, valued women not only as royal consorts, but as keepers of domestic and sacred order. Blending perfumes was seen as a feminine and priestly act. Their tools, found in excavations beneath what was once the innermost wall of Ecbatana, include small crucibles for boiling oils, clay retorts with soot marks from resin distillation, bone spatulas used for mixing paste, and shards of ceramic vessels marked with Median glyphs indicating month, phase, or celestial alignment. This suggests a highly organized system, one that understood time, not just substance. But as with all empires, time would eventually pass them by. The rise of the Achaemenid Persians in the mid-6th century BCE brought sweeping changes. Ecbatana was not destroyed, it was absorbed. Cyrus the Great respected the city and made it one of his summer residences. But the sacred secrecy of the Median perfumers was diluted. Their methods were absorbed into a wider imperial system. Their roles became bureaucratic. Their art, once intimate, became institutional. Still, one wonders, in the great perfumed halls of Persepolis, how many of the scents can be traced back to a hilltop city beneath 7 painted walls? How many blends were copied, rebranded, or merely remembered in altered form? And if we could step into one of those blending rooms, now smell the oils, hear the low hum of boiling, see the marks of time on bronze bowls, would we recognize what was being created? Would we call it perfume, or would we understand it as something else entirely? Something closer to power made liquid, made smoke. The deeper you move into the Median palace complex at Ecbatana, the quieter it becomes. The outer courtyards echo with the voices of attendants and visiting envoys, but within the innermost precincts beyond the 5th wall, in shaded rooms where the sun rarely reaches there, lies a different world. Here, scent is language. The Tarkibgaran, the Median court's perfumers and olfactory alchemists, worked in this cloistered space, surrounded not by weapons or scribes, but by burners, basins, and jars sealed with wax and pitch. They did not shout their findings across marble halls. Instead, they observed, they waited, they listened to oils change under heat. What they produced shaped court etiquette, spiritual ritual, and foreign perception alike. But they did not seek credit. Their success was measured in the way a room felt before a royal decree, how the air seemed to bend, how conversation slowed, how visitors blinked and softened their posture. To modern historians, the work of these perfumers has been elusive. No complete Median perfume formula has survived, but in fragments, clay tablets, inscriptions, residue analysis, we can begin to reconstruct the architecture of their science. The method of Median perfume making. Unlike later Roman perfumers, who favored heavy maceration in oil, the Median process was built around multi-stage scent layering, each aligned with both astrological and seasonal calendars. One known method involved 3 phases. The root infusion, Zambaksh. This base involved boiling crushed roots such as vetiver, spikenard, or calamus in water mixed with wine vinegar. It was cooled in bronze vessels and left in shaded cellars for 3 days. This phase provided an earthy foundation, believed to stabilize the hot energies of the scent. The oil harmonization, bar royan. This middle phase blended animal fats or nut oils, almond, walnut, or goat tallow with concentrated plant extracts. The infusions were heated slowly using coal embers rather than open flame, so as not to scare the oils, as one poetic inscription describes. The spirit layer Oamazden. Here, aromatic resins myrrh, labdanum, mastic were suspended over burning coals on thin bronze sieves. The rising smoke passed through layers of silk soaked in rosewater or saffron, which absorbed the smoke's essence. This perfumed silk was then wrung into the final blend, adding the faintest trace of divine breath, the Median term for aromatic vapor. It was this final step that made Median perfumes distinct. They were touched by smoke but not burned. This gentle vapor infusion created complex, ephemeral scents that changed depending on body heat, air moisture, or even emotion. No two applications were exactly alike. The scent was alive. Symbolism and structure. The Median perfumers worked not only with chemistry but with philosophy. Each ingredient had symbolic value. Cedar represented endurance, rose, balance, saffron, clarity. A perfumer was expected to blend not only for smell but for moral equilibrium. A tablet fragment from the Ekbatana archive, now in the Iran Bastan Museum, reads, "To scent a king is not to please him. It is to prepare the air for decisions." The blending rooms were designed accordingly. Low ceilings to retain warmth, stone floors for cooling, water channels cut through the stone to regulate humidity. Copper pots were used for bright, uplifting scents, iron pots for grounding, heavier ones. The walls were coated with lime plaster, which naturally absorbed excess oil vapors and prevented contamination. Certain practices were strictly timed. The new moon was considered best for starting rose infusions. The full moon, by contrast, was reserved for myrrh reductions and prayers. Some records suggest that final blends were sealed with a prayer and a breath literally breathing into the jar before closing it with wax, symbolically infusing it with the maker's intention. This was alchemy not as manipulation, but as harmony, finding the moment when each component, each element wanted to work together. Perfume as surveillance. But not all applications of perfume were benign. In the later Median court, scent became an instrument of quiet power, used to shape court politics and even eavesdrop. One text written in a Median Kassite hybrid dialect tells of Nasir Baksh, or watcher's incense. This was a scent burned in antechambers known for their poor acoustics. The blend included valerian, crushed juniper, and a trace of opium. The effect, when gently inhaled, was to slow thought and speech, making visitors more transparent and less guarded in conversation. It was not a poison, it was a fog. Court attendants were trained to recognize different incense blends as signals. One scent might indicate a delay in royal arrival. Another might serve as an olfactory doorbell, announcing a visitor before they spoke. Still another might serve as warning. An acrid mix of spoiled myrrh and sour almond, burned to indicate displeasure without words. In this way, the Median court became an invisible symphony of smells, each note choreographed, each tone deliberate. Even punishment was sometimes olfactory. Disgraced nobles were assigned unperfumed quarters, an indignity that marked them socially. Others were given garments scented with lower caste blends, signaling their fall from favor. Women of the vial. While much of ancient alchemy is male-dominated in historical record, the Median court offers rare glimpses of female scentmakers. The most famous of these was a woman known in fragments only as Nahidvata, a priestess perfumer believed to have overseen the purification rites for the royal Zoroastrian fire. Though no complete biography survives, several blend records are marked with her seal, a stylized flame beside the glyph for rose oil. She is believed to have developed a method of triple filtration for floral extracts, producing a water-based perfume, one of the earliest known in the region. Her workshop, thought to be near the fire temple in Ekbatana, used shallow pools of sun-warmed water to float rose petals during early morning hours. The dew-laden petals released their scent into the water, which was then filtered through wool cloth and stored in ceramic vessels lined with beeswax. This method, while inefficient by modern standards, created a delicate scent with religious purity. Her formulas survived the fall of the Median Empire, passing into early Persian records. Some even suggest her descendants were invited to Persepolis under Darius I to continue their work bringing Median olfactory science into the Achaemenid Golden Age. The fade of a fragrant A. By the time Cyrus the Great absorbed Media into his rising empire, the blending rooms of Ecbatana were no longer secret. The formulas were copied, the tools redistributed, the Tarkibgaran either relocated or absorbed into the larger imperial apparatus. And yet their sensory legacy remained. The idea that scent could communicate mood, intention, rank, that fragrance was an extension of rule would be carried forward by Persian, Parthian, and later Islamic courts. Ecbatana's perfume philosophy became, over time, a cultural inheritance. But one cannot help but wonder, what did those last Median perfumers feel, watching their methods become state property? What did it mean to see something once sacred become standardized? Did they resist, or did they adapt? In a final act of silent rebellion, one Median perfume maker is said to have burned an entire year's batch of oil before departing for Persepolis, releasing it into the mountain air with a single line. Better the wind remember us than the record. And so we ask, if scent is the most fleeting of legacies, is it also the most profound? Centuries have passed, empires have risen and fallen, yet beneath the modern city of Hamadan, built atop ancient Ecbatana, the scent of its past sometimes seems to stir lightly, faintly, like the trace of resin warming in the sun. The Median Empire, as history records it, disappeared into the narrative of the Achaemenids. Cyrus the Great conquered Ecbatana in 550 BCE and absorbed its customs, courts, and craftsmen. He preserved the city as a summer capital and repurposed its palaces. To many, this transition was peaceful, even progressive. Yet behind the stone walls in the cloisters of the Tarkibgaran, something more complex unfolded. The Median perfumers, artists, alchemists, quiet keepers of the court's sensory soul faced a question that echoes through all transitions of power. What becomes of knowledge when its patron vanishes? The early years of Achaemenid rule were cautious. Cyrus understood the value of Median expertise. He retained many court officials and maintained the sacred fire temples. Some believe he even invited the Tarkibgaran to serve in the newly built sanctuaries of Pasargadae and later Persepolis. Others, however, refused. For them, their work had been deeply tied to the Median kingship, to a metaphysical structure they no longer recognized. To blend perfume for a new ruler was not simply a change in employment. It was a rupture in ritual. Among the few surviving fragments from this period is a clay tablet, cracked and water-damaged, now stored in the Tehran archives. It reads, "The oils remember the hand. Do not let them forget their name." It is unclear whether this was a formula note, a personal warning, or a poetic farewell, but its meaning lingers. There was something sacred in the craft, something not easily surrendered to empire. The burial of formulas. In the foothills north of Hamadan, archaeologists in the 1970s uncovered what appeared to be a Median storage vault. It was carved into the mountain rock, sealed with large limestone slabs, and filled not with gold or grain, but with vessels, some intact, others shattered. Inside the jars were dried remnants of oils and resin-infused cloths. Alongside them were wax tablets, etched with signs not seen elsewhere in Median writing. The glyphs appeared to be a hybrid of botanical terms, zodiac symbols, and instructions rendered in metaphor. Cool the anger, bind the sun to the root, leave it to listen in the dark. The vault had no inscriptions naming its owner, but one broken pot bore a seal matching that of Nahidvata, the renowned priestess perfumer. Perhaps this was her final act of burial, not of treasure, but of scented knowledge too precious to be left in careless hands. From these remains, modern chemists have attempted reconstructions. The traces of rose, cedar, myrrh, and even animal musk still cling to the walls of the clay. While the exact blends may never be replicated, the techniques have informed a deeper understanding of early distillation and oil infusion in ancient Iran. And more than chemistry, these discoveries provide a glimpse into the emotional continuity of scent. These were not just perfumes. They were rituals in liquid form, reminders of cycles, seasons, silences. Legacy in the shadows. The Median perfumers did not leave a lasting dynasty. They left no temple to their craft. But the philosophies they followed, the careful timing, the spiritual correspondence of ingredients, the belief that scent could shape fate did not vanish. They simply shifted names and forms. In the Persian courts of Darius and Xerxes, the Carapans, priest-scientists, began using scent in both fire ritual and statecraft. Their tools grew more refined, their formulas broader, but the reverence for scent as structure was inherited directly from Ecbatana. Later, during the Parthian and Sasanian eras, Persian nobles continued to view perfumery as a learned and spiritual art. Fragrant oils were used to mark births, coronations, military victories, and moments of mourning. In the Zoroastrian Avesta, references to sweet smoke as a sacred purifier echo Median customs. The old beliefs endured even if their origin was forgotten. The medieval Islamic world, too, bears the scent of Ecbatana. The scholar and physician Avicenna ibn Sina, born in the same region once ruled by the Medes, would later refine the process of steam distillation, revolutionizing perfume making. Though his work was based on Greek and Arabic sources, some believe he may have drawn on local traditions, oral remnants of a Median art, passed down quietly through generations. Even in the design of Persian gardens, walled enclosures filled with aromatic plants, flowing water, and geometric balance, we see a visual and olfactory echo of Ecbatana's court philosophy. That scent, space, and stillness together create power without violence. The silence of stones. Today, little remains of the Median capital. Modern Hamadan covers the site. The 7 painted walls described by Herodotus are gone, if they ever existed. Visitors walk its streets unaware that beneath their feet, the air once shimmered with scent from cedar smoke rising at dawn, to rosewater flicked across polished floors before diplomatic meetings. But fragments persist. In a small room of the Hamadan Museum, a simple clay pot sits under glass. It has no jewels, no gold inlay, just a faint residue around its mouth and a small stylized flame carved near the base. It is labeled Unidentified Vessel, Median Period. But to those who have studied the records, its form is unmistakable. It is a perfume flask, one of the few to survive intact. Nearby, a bronze spatula lies beside a pestle, modest tools, worn smooth by years of mixing and grinding, tools that belonged not to warriors but to those who scented the breath of kings. Their names are gone, their rooms are dust, but when you stand in that room, you might notice something unusual. Not strong barely there, but a dry sweetness in the air, as if the clay has not forgotten. Maybe it hasn't. Maybe the wind remembers the formula, even if we do not. And so we reflect. If power was once measured not by stone and steel, but by the softness of a scent, what have we lost by forgetting to breathe before we build? Story 4. The queen sent Adosa, daughter of Cyrus, and the art of influence. Before the conquests of Alexander, before the splendor of Persepolis, before even the ink of Herodotus dried on papyrus, there was Adosa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, sister-wife to Cambyses, consort to Darius I, and mother of Xerxes I. History remembers her as many things: royal woman, advisor, strategist. But hidden between the lines of official accounts is something less discussed, and perhaps more powerful: her role as the invisible architect of courtly scent, the quiet manipulator of atmosphere and meaning in the Achaemenid Empire. Atossa lived at the intersection of three empires. Her father founded the first Persian Empire, her husband secured its expansion, and her son would lead it to its greatest heights. Yet she held no armies, commanded no fleets. Her influence flowed through softer channels: ritual, etiquette, education, and perhaps most intriguingly, aroma. In an empire that valued ceremonial precision, where scent was treated not as indulgence but as social signal, Atossa understood how to command space without speaking a word. A house of scent and symbol. The royal harem of the Achaemenids, unlike the romanticized versions of later centuries, was not merely a place of seclusion or pleasure. It was a political center, especially for women of rank. Atossa, as queen, presided over this space. Her rooms were described by later Greek writers as filled with fragrant air and heavy cloths, a euphemism perhaps for controlled scent environments, fragrance as boundary. The court protocol dictated that no male servant could enter Atossa's chambers unsummoned. Instead, her attendants, female and often multilingual, were trained in the arts of grooming, cloth preparation, and scent application. These were not idle skills. The perfume blends they used were recorded and passed down, tied to seasonal, spiritual, and diplomatic cycles. The queen's personal scent changed by month, aligning with Zoroastrian holy days and lunar phases. One surviving tablet from the Persepolis fortification archive refers to the delivery of 5 measures of rose oil to the royal woman in residence. Other records list saffron-steeped linen sent to the palace's inner rooms, crushed cardamom and cinnamon for the queen's sleeping quarters, frankincense and dried citrus peel prepared for audiences of foreign wives. These notes are mundane in appearance, but their regularity shows intention. In a world where scent meant meaning, Atossa was not simply being adorned, she was orchestrating an experience. The fragrance of authority. When Darius I came to power following the tumultuous reign of Bardia, or the impostor known as Gaumata, it was Atossa who gave legitimacy to the new regime. She was not only the daughter of Cyrus the Great, but the bridge between dynasties, and she used every tool available to make the transition appear seamless. Among the most subtle of these tools was olfactory symbolism. Greek sources such as Ctesias and Herodotus, though filtered through cultural misunderstanding, make repeated references to the perfumed presence of Persian queens. One fragment even describes Atossa's arrival at a court festival as being preceded not by heralds, but by a waft of saffron and almond. Imagine the scene: a tense audience, political uncertainties in the air, and then a sudden shift, the arrival of scent before speech. This was no accident. Atossa understood that to command without violence was to manipulate anticipation. And scent, unlike speech or gesture, enters the brain before it is consciously noticed. By adjusting the fragrance of a room, the materials of her clothing, or even the oils burned in the corner of her chambers, Atossa could set tone, expectation, and emotional balance long before a word was spoken. This wasn't magic, it was strategy. For example, when receiving Babylonian emissaries, she reportedly wore a blend including mastic and date oil aromas associated with fertility and wealth in Mesopotamian culture. Before speaking with Zoroastrian priests, she favored clean-smelling blends of myrtle and river mint, evoking spiritual clarity. In morning rituals, she covered herself in smoke-dried wool rubbed with black amber and balsam, a scent remembered for weeks afterward by those who recorded the funeral rites. Her scent changed with purpose. Like clothing or jewels, it was a form of political expression. Healing in the shadows. There is another thread to Atossa's legacy, one tied not to politics, but to care and convalescence. Herodotus tells a famous, and somewhat strange, story that Atossa developed a growth on her breast, and that it was removed by the Greek physician Demos of Croton, who had been taken captive and brought to the Persian court. The story has been debated. Some say it's apocryphal, others think it shows early awareness of cancer. But what matters here is that Atossa did not vanish from public life after her illness. In fact, she seems to have gained influence. What Greek sources don't mention, but Persian records hint at, is her increased interest in healing rituals and scented salves during this period. An entry in a Persepolitan account lists the procurement of dried asphodel root, cypress oil, goat tallow blended with poppy essence. These were likely ingredients for wound care, or perhaps for ceremonial anointing. It is possible that Atossa herself directed their preparation not only for her recovery, but as part of a broader program of courtly hygiene and ritual purification. Following this period, there is a noted increase in references to the queen's salves among court records. Some speculate that Atossa began patronizing a corps of female healers, whose knowledge of scent and herbology became essential to the court. Whether as protector, patient, or patron, she helped cement the connection between scent, wellness, and rule. The legacy through Xerxes. When Atossa's son, Xerxes I, inherited the throne, he carried with him more than military ambition. He inherited a framework of ceremony shaped by his mother. His famous invasion of Greece is remembered for its scale and spectacle, but also for its rituals. Prior to crossing the Hellespont, Herodotus describes a great sacrifice, a burning of incense, and a fragrant calm before war. This fusion of scent and power of using aroma to shape moment and memory was not incidental. It was maternal inheritance. Xerxes would go on to rule with grandeur but also with theatricality. He understood, perhaps too well, that victory was fleeting but presence could be eternal if shaped correctly. His palace, like Darius's, was perfumed. His festivals, scented. His queen, Amstress, followed similar protocols of fragrance. And behind all of this was Atossa, now aged, now fading from the records but still present in practice. In the end, there is no monument to Atossa's olfactory genius. No statue marks her use of scent to shape diplomacy. But in the rhythms of the Achaemenid court, the incense at dawn, the rosewater rituals, the perfumed cloaks of ambassadors, we catch a glimpse of her mind. She was a queen, yes, but also an engineer of perception, a strategist of atmosphere, and perhaps the first recorded woman in history to master the power of presence through scent. And so we wonder, can a woman shape an empire not with armies, but with air? In the stone corridors of Persepolis, beneath towering reliefs of kings and tribute-bearers, there was another world at work, quieter, softer, but no less powerful. It was a world of women, scent, and ritual. At its center stood Atossa, no longer a young queen but now the great mother of the empire, overseeing not just family, but image, tone, and the silent codes that shaped behavior within the Achaemenid court. We often imagine ancient power as loud chariots, proclamations, armies on the march. But Atossa's power was something else entirely, persistent, aromatic, and disciplined. She understood that scent, properly curated, was not merely a cosmetic detail, but a code, one as effective as armor or decree. And in the world she helped shape, fragrance became a language all its own. Scent as status, rank, and ritual. By the mid-reign of Darius I, a detailed system of hierarchical scent had emerged within the court. This was not written into law, but it was practiced with the precision of sacred ritual. Every rank, whether royal wife, concubine, attendant, or noble guest, had a designated palette of scent permissions, enforced and monitored by Atossa's chamber officials. Royal garments were washed and infused with saffron water or rose oil, and pressed with stones warmed over cedar embers. Noblewomen of the court were allowed cinnamon oil on feast days, but forbidden sandalwood except during mourning. Concubines, often foreign-born, wore localized scents to distinguish their cultural origin. Honeyed pomegranate for Babylonians, olive leaf for Ionian Greeks. These distinctions were not incidental. They signaled identity, availability, mourning, pregnancy, even temporary withdrawal from ceremonial life. Atossa ensured this system, functioned with military clarity. A set of Elamite administrative tablets from the fortification archive of Persepolis includes hundreds of transactions for aromatic ingredients, all classified not just by product and weight, but destination within the palace. Many of the entries are marked Napsa Atusa, likely shorthand for materials requested directly by Athos's stewards. These included myrrh paste in beeswax, designated for midnight burning; clove-infused fig oil, for garments prepared in advance of foreign envoy visit; powdered iris root, used in drying chambers to reduce moisture in linens. What emerges is a picture of the court not merely as a place of power, but as a theatrical space, stage managed by scent, and Atossa was its unseen director. The cloister of blends. Within her own wing of the palace, Atossa maintained a private workshop known in later Greek sources as the Thalame Aromatica, the fragrance room. This was not a place of leisure, but of experimentation and preservation. While the primary task of formulation remained with court perfumers, carapans, Atossa herself was said to have been involved in blending select oils, particularly those used in birth rituals, funerary rites, and treaty ceremonies. According to one fragment in the works of the later historian Ctesias, though often viewed with skepticism, Atossa once burned a secret blend during a political marriage ceremony that had nearly collapsed in dispute. The blend included juniper, saffron, and crushed dried fig, and was said to have filled the air with the smell of settled peace. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reflects something important. Atossa's authority was trusted in moments of fragility. Inside the fragrance room, ingredients were stored in ceramic and alabaster jars, each marked with a glyph signifying time of harvest, origin of ingredient, astrological phase, ritual use. These were not merely materials, they were ritual tools. A small spoon of galbanum, applied in the wrong season, could signify insult instead of invitation. Atossa's staff knew these distinctions. They weren't serving fragrance, they were administering meaning. A single visitor walking into her presence would know her mood before she spoke, based on what hung in the air. Politics by perfume. Atossa's role in diplomacy went far beyond scent, but scent remained one of her key methods of non-verbal influence. In royal audiences, she was rarely the loudest voice, yet she shaped the tone before the first word was spoken. A Babylonian envoy's tablet preserved at Sippar includes a record of the queen's chamber bearing the scent of warmth and ironwood, a phrase likely meant to capture the emotive atmosphere of an otherwise tense negotiation. In a setting where open expression was often dangerous, the use of scent as psychological terrain gave Atossa subtle leverage. She also used fragrance to build alliances with other royal women, a seldom discussed but essential political strategy in the empire. Through marriage, conquest, and tribute, many noble daughters from Egypt, Lydia, India, and beyond were sent to Persepolis as part of diplomatic agreements. Atossa met them not with hostility, but with ritual. Upon their arrival, their garments were washed in a shared floral blend, symbolizing their entry into the house of the great king. A private ceremony was held where each woman received a personal vial of oil, blended according to her homeland's plants, and sensed a fusion of old and new identity. These oils became part of their courtly identity and were used during festivals, feasts, and court processions. Through these gestures, Atossa turned potential rivals into scented kin. Where words might have faltered, aroma bound the air between them. The scent of mourning, the scent of rule. Later in life, Atossa was described as the keeper of the hush, a title that appears in a now fragmentary palace ledger. Whether this was ceremonial or affectionate, we don't know. But during the final years of Darius's rule, Atossa gradually retreated from public ceremony and turned her focus to legacy. In the records of Xerxes's coronation, several scent-based rituals are attributed to Atossa. The blessing of the new king's robes using a rare oil made from iris and walnut. The purification of the royal throne room using cedar and vinegar vapors before Xerxes's first address. The mourning protocol upon Darius's death, in which the entire palace complex was perfumed with a blend of burnt fig, cypress, and opopanax. The final blend is notable. It was not a sweet scent. It was dry, dense, and almost bitter. It left behind not freshness but stillness, a kind of scented silence. Those who described it afterward said it made the air wait. Even in grief, Atossa orchestrated perception. She passed away during the reign of Xerxes, likely around 475 BCE. No formal eulogy survives, but in the ceremonial calendar, a new observance was added for the court women, Day of the Quiet Rose, during which no perfumes were worn except a single drop of diluted rose water behind each ear, a gesture of absence more than presence. In the fading light of her life, Atossa left behind no battles, no monuments, but she left something else, a legacy woven into air, into cloth, into routine. She taught a generation how to hold power without raising a voice, how to shape a moment by shaping what it smells like, how to govern mood before governing men. And though her name would recede into the footnotes of empire, her work lingered in every corridor, in every blend burned before council, in every oil smeared upon a newborn royal. Because Atossa understood what few in her world or ours ever truly grasp, that what you remember most is not what was said, but how the room felt. And so we ask, what happens to history when its greatest architects leave no words, only scent? Time forgets most queens. Names vanish from tablets, faces crumble from stone. But scent, the most ephemeral of all things, sometimes lingers impossibly against all logic. It clings not to the body but to memory, to atmosphere, to the architecture of emotion. Atossa, queen of the Persian Empire, understood this better than any of her contemporaries. She built no army, launched no conquest, but she shaped the air that surrounded power. And power, once surrounded by beauty and precision, becomes something more durable than empire. By the end of her life, Atossa had lived through 3 reigns: her father Cyrus's visionary expansion, her husband Darius's administrative mastery, and her son Xerxes's dramatic imperial campaigns. She had seen the empire grow, fracture, and reassert itself. But more than this, she had established a model of influence through presence, not dominance. She did not carve law into stone. She etched memory into rooms. Scent as strategy, the invisible curriculum. Atossa's true legacy was not only her influence in her lifetime, but the institutional knowledge she embedded into the court itself. In the decades after her death, a system of scented ritual and olfactory etiquette became codified, even without being officially written. In the Achaemenid palace calendar, specific scent protocols were tied to births of royal children, walnut oil and myrtle smoke; coronations, sandalwood and frankincense; mourning, opopanax and fig ash; treaty signings, saffron and aged cedar. These associations were not accidental. They were echoes of the practice Atossa had modeled and likely trained others to continue. A small collection of wax tablets recovered from Persepolis and inscribed in Old Persian and Elamite suggests that a female steward class, perhaps descended from Atossa's attendants, was responsible for maintaining these scent protocols. Their names are not preserved, but their roles are. She who prepares the robes, guardian of the warming stones, the mixer of vessels, she who begins the air. Even after the queen was gone, her scent spoke for her. Posthumous power and sacred remembrance. It is likely that Atossa was entombed in Nakshi Rostam, near her husband Darius and other Achaemenid kings. The tombs were carved high into the cliff face, inaccessible but visible from miles away, eternal watchposts over the dry plain. Inside the tomb complex, priests performed annual rituals, One rare inscription, dating to the reign of Artaxerxes I, refers to an offering made in the chamber of the queen. It lists 2 jars of myrrh and saffron, a perfumed wool strip marked with her family seal, a lamp filled with rose oil, to be burned only during the festival of stillness. No record tells us what this festival was or how long it endured, but the idea that scent continued to be offered to Atossa decades after her death shows something rare, a non-militarized form of posthumous reverence. She had no victory monuments, but she had perfume offerings. In many ways, this mirrors Zoroastrian thought, particularly the idea of Fravashi, the eternal spirit of an individual, which continues to exist after death and may be honored by ritual. Atossa's Fravashi, it seems, was remembered through air, fragrance, and balance. Legacy in the empire and beyond. As the Achaemenid Empire passed through hands Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and beyond, the core of Atossa's influence persisted in subtler forms. While kings came to represent the visible might of Persia, courtly ritual became the soft muscle of continuity. Greek observers during the later Achaemenid period frequently described the Persian court as smothered in perfume, often with sarcasm or disdain. But beneath their criticism is a recognition. Scent mattered. It was everywhere, in halls, on robes, in the folds of diplomatic ritual. The Greeks didn't understand it fully, but they recorded it nonetheless. Even Alexander the Great, upon entering Persepolis, reportedly commented on the perfumed walls and aromatic storehouses he encountered before the city's destruction. Whether he admired them or found them excessive, he took the time to note them. And in doing so, he noted her. For while men wrote in ink and stone, Atossa had written in atmosphere. The feminine language of empire. The legacy of Atossa also reaches forward not just through the Achaemenid dynasty, but through the broader historical thread of women as keepers of fragrance and ritual. In Sasanian Persia, royal women curated scent libraries for palace use. In early Islamic courts, female perfumers served as healers and confidants. Even in medieval Europe, queens and noblewomen adopted scented handkerchiefs and chamber perfumes as instruments of mood and message. The practice of using scent as courtly communication traces back, arguably, to Atossa's codification of this olfactory literacy. She proved that fragrance, when wielded with intention, was not indulgence, but power. Not just power to influence others, but to shape the terms of memory itself. Atossa in the present. Today, few people speak her name. No city bears her image, but the model she built persists. In the rosewater that is sprinkled before guests in Shiraz. In the incense burned before sacred fire in Zoroastrian temples. In the unspoken associations we all hold, lavender for calm, myrrh for mourning, citrus for clarity. We live in a world where fragrance still signals mood, intent, and care, where the air around us is curated more than we admit, where memory is often tied to what the room smelled like when something important happened. These are not trivialities. They are, in Atossa's terms, tools of presence. And so her true legacy may be this: that she taught the world a form of leadership measured not in orders given or battles won, but in air altered, attention shaped, and moments held. Because history may forget what you did, but not how you made the world feel. And so we ask, if power leaves no monument, but lingers softly in the breath of memory, is that not the greatest empire of all? Story 5. The perfumed tombs of Pasargadae death and the aromas of kings. It begins, as so many things in Persian history do, with Cyrus the Great. On the open plain near the river Palvar in southern Iran, the wind whispers through yellow grasses and scattered stones. And there, among them, stands a simple yet monumental structure, the tomb of Cyrus, founder of the Achaemenid Empire. 6 stone steps rise to a rectangular chamber topped by a steep gabled roof. No inscriptions remain to speak his name aloud, but ancient writers from Alexander to Strabo agreed. This was where the empire began its eternal sleep. But the tomb did not rest in silence, not entirely. According to Greek and Babylonian sources alike, the air within and around the tomb of Cyrus was once carefully scented, a space designed to blend reverence and ritual with fragrance. Though stripped of decoration today, Pasargadae was once the epicenter of a funerary philosophy built on smell. Here, fragrance served not as embellishment, but as sacred seal, a tool for purifying, protecting, and dignifying the memory of kings. Because to bury an Achaemenid monarch was not merely to entomb a body, it was to create a temple of transition, a place where the senses were aligned with cosmic order, and where aroma marked the soul's passage between realms. The tomb as ritual chamber. Pasargadae, founded by Cyrus around 546 BCE, was more than a city, it was a prototype. A sacred capital built to embody the ideals of kingship and divine favor. Its gardens, palaces, and audience halls were laid out along geometric lines, but it was the tomb that stood slightly apart, solitary, elevated, and perfumed. Greek visitors who saw the tomb during the time of Alexander described the interior chamber as containing a golden sarcophagus, a table set with precious offerings, a couch draped in fine linens, and notably, aromatic substances for preserving the king. Arrian, writing in the 2nd century CE, recorded that when Alexander opened the tomb in 330 BCE, he found a room thick with fragrant air, unspoiled by time. While this may be poetic exaggeration, it points to a deeper truth. The tomb was not sealed in sterility, it was sealed in ritual scent. This reflects Zoroastrian beliefs about purity and the afterlife. Death was considered a dangerous transition, a moment when the body, once sacred, could become a source of corruption, nasu. To prevent impurity, the deceased had to be cleansed, protected, and watched. And scent, particularly from incense and resins, played a central role in that safeguarding. In Pasargadae, the tombs of the kings, though fewer than imagined, were prepared with careful olfactory engineering. Burners placed at strategic points, linens infused with rosewater, saffron, and myrrh, oils sealed in ceramic jars, their contents periodically replenished by temple caretakers. In this way, the tomb became not just a resting place, but a living monument, a space where the air itself remembered the king. The aromatic afterlife. From what we can reconstruct, the embalming of Cyrus and his successors likely followed a ritual program that blended Achaemenid customs with older Median and Elamite traditions. A typical preparation may have included washing the body in water infused with myrrh, a floral vinegar made from crushed apricots and bitter herbs, rubbing the skin with cedar oil, known for its preservative and cleansing properties, packing the linen shrouds with aromatic herbs and resins including galbanum, mastic, and dried rose petals, placing within the tomb clay dishes of smoldering incense to fill the space with continuous smoke during the burial period. This was not mummification, as in Egypt, nor cremation as in India. It was a scented stillness, meant to honor the king while aligning his body with the divine order, a Shah of the universe. The air inside the tomb was engineered to hold balance, neither overly sweet nor cloying, but warm, rich, and calm. Even the stone architecture supported this purpose. The chamber's dimensions were compact and sealed. It was designed to hold scent, to trap it and slow its escape. The material's white limestone, carefully joined without mortar, created a stable climate, limiting airflow while subtly amplifying the aromatic tones. The tomb, in effect, became a perfume box of sovereignty. The role of the Watchers of the Air. Lesser known but deeply significant were the temple servants assigned to maintain the tomb's integrity. These were the fragrance keepers, or Padshe Nafaria, a role referenced in both Elamite and Old Persian administrative tablets. Their responsibilities included ensuring incense burners were refilled on holy days, inspecting the linen-wrapped urns that held sacred oils, monitoring air circulation within the tomb chamber, performing seasonal purification rituals using vapor-infused herbs. One particularly detailed record describes a wind blessing ritual in which cedarwood and saffron were placed in shallow basins of water near the tomb, their scent lifted slowly into the air by the mid-morning breeze. This was more than reverence, it was maintenance of memory. As long as the tomb retained its scent, the king was considered present, watching. When the fragrance faded, it was a sign either of neglect or cosmic imbalance. And so, the watchers of the air became not only stewards of scent, but guardians of continuity. Fragrance as political boundary. Even beyond the tomb walls, Pasargadae was marked by scented boundaries. The sacred garden, now barely visible in ruins, once held channels of running water and beds of aromatic plants. Historians believe this garden was scented intentionally, not just with natural flora, but with oils and smokes applied during festivals. During the spring equinox, when the king renewed his divine legitimacy in public ceremony, the garden was prepared days in advance. Paths were swept with myrtle water. Cypress leaves were burned at dawn. The robes worn by nobles were pre-treated with blends assigned by court perfumers, their purpose not decorative but symbolic. One could tell a general from a priest by how he smelled. One could sense the beginning of a festival by the subtle shift in the city's scent profile. Even criminals, when allowed back into public ritual life, were required to wear neutralizing scents: clay powder, bitter almond oil, vinegar rinses. Their reintegration was sensed before it was seen. In this way, aroma became a political tool, a way of shaping space, identity, and acceptance. And the tombs, at the center of it all, served as the permanent aromatic reference point, the fixed scent that anchored all other variation. The Greek intrusion and the smell of sacrilege. When Alexander the Great arrived at Pasargadae in 330 BCE, he made a point to visit the tomb of Shiraz. The sources differ slightly, but Arrian, Plutarch, and others agree. He was deeply moved. But what struck him most was not the architecture, it was what the tomb had once held. According to Aristobulus, one of Alexander's companions, the tomb had been robbed by local satraps before Alexander's arrival. The sarcophagus was desecrated, the offerings removed, and the scent, the protective, sacred scent, was gone. Alexander, in an uncharacteristic act of preservation, ordered the tomb restored. He replaced the linens, commissioned new oil burners, and assigned guards to watch over the site. In doing so, he acknowledged a truth no conqueror could ignore. This tomb was not just a burial site, it was the perfumed cornerstone of an empire. And empires, even new ones, require continuity to thrive. And so, as the wind moves over the plains of Pasargadae today, empty, dry, unperfumed, you may still feel a whisper. Not a voice, but a change in the air. As if something important once scented this ground and time itself remembers. And you may find yourself asking, when a king dies, is he buried in silence, or in the lingering fragrance of a world he once shaped? In the silent city of Pasargadae, long after the torches were extinguished and the king's bodies laid to rest, the scent remained. It clung to stone. It lingered in porous ceramic jars buried beneath lintels. It wove itself into the fabric of mourning rituals and imperial ideology. For centuries, the tomb of Cyrus the Great and those who followed was not merely a site of burial, but a living system of aromatic maintenance, designed to sustain memory through the air itself. This was no accident. It was the deliberate work of a small, often invisible class of workers who oversaw what might be called the olfactory infrastructure of the empire. The Pace Napharia, scent keepers of the king. They were rarely named in tablets. Most references come in oblique phrases. those who prepare the wind of rest, she who oils the robes of the rock, servant of smoke at the house of silence. But their function is unmistakable. These were the watchers of fragrance, the court personnel assigned to preserve the aromatic sanctity of royal tombs, not as a gesture of sentiment, but as an act of ritual governance. Their responsibilities included maintaining sealed oil vessels stored in the subterranean chambers, inspecting incense burners to ensure correct resins were used for holy days, applying protective balms to wooden interior furnishings, both aromatic and preservative, replacing saturated linens, which had absorbed scent but reached olfactory fatigue. In some years, records from Elamite scribes mention caravans delivering 3 skins of almond oil from Susa, 20 jars of myrtle vinegar from Media, cypress sap cut during the high moon, saffron threads weighed with silver dust. Each of these items bore not just economic value, but ritual weight. They weren't consumables, they were ingredients in memory's recipe, reminders of the living king's virtues and the continued cosmic harmony of his reign. It was said that if the tomb lost its scent, the realm lost its center of stillness. Seasonal rites of the air. Just as the palace held seasonal festivals for life planting, equinox, coronation, so too did Pasargadae maintain an annual calendar of death rites, where scent played the lead role. One such rite, referenced in a clay tablet unearthed near the Four Gardens complex, was the turning of the air ceremony, believed to take place during Mayagan, the autumnal festival of justice and harvest. This ritual was designed to refresh the tomb's inner chamber. Priests would burn a blend of fenugreek, sandalwood, and date sap. Perfumed steam would be piped through ceramic tubes into the lower crevices of the tomb. The watchers would anoint the tomb's outer steps with rose vinegar, so that pilgrims ascending to the platform would carry the scent up with them. Nobles wore a prescribed scent profile: earthy cedar for warriors, sweet myrrh for elders, light lavender for children. This was not mourning, it was maintenance, a recalibration of sacred atmosphere. Much like the ancient belief in tending the fire on an altar, tending the tomb's scent ensured continuity with the realm of divine order, Asha, preventing rot physical, spiritual, or political. A garden for the dead. To the west of Cyrus's tomb once lay a perfumed garden, a concept now only visible in archaeological outlines and in dusty fragments of text. This was no pleasure garden. It was a sensory perimeter for the dead. In these plots grew bitter orange and damask rose to symbolize mourning and sweetness, sage and thyme for purification, cypress always for eternity and cosmic order, sweet basil used to flavor the air before processions. Small reed channels carried water scented with herbs through the beds. On certain days, caretakers would float scented cloths in the pools, allowing them to soak and slowly release aroma into the breeze. Greek visitors like Onesicritus, who came with Alexander's entourage, mistook this as some strange luxury. He described the garden as unnaturally sweet, a place not for kings but for spirits and gods. He may not have been wrong. The garden was a tombscape, where memory walked quietly, carried not in stories or song, but in scent signatures only the initiated understood. Memory as molecule, the science of preservation. Recent archaeological efforts suggest that certain tomb contents were replaced multiple times across generations. Organic residue analysis from burial vessels near the Pasargadae site indicates that aromatic compounds were periodically refreshed not only out of ritual, but also to maintain the chemical stability of the tomb atmosphere. This was practical science as ritual. Cedar oil discouraged bacterial growth. Myrrh and frankincense had antifungal properties. Rosewater, besides masking decay, helped maintain linen pliability. Sandalwood was used for both fragrance and as a pest deterrent. These were not unthinking rituals. They were the result of centuries of accumulated empirical wisdom, encoded in the sacred language of mourning, but grounded in survival logic. And through this logic, Athos's system of scent as sovereign grammar found its echo in the tombs. The smell of loss, the smell of empire. But nothing lasts forever. In the later Achaemenid period, during the chaos of palace rivalries, foreign threats, and eventual conquest by Macedonian forces, the scent rituals began to fade. Not abruptly, but imperceptibly, like a perfume left uncapped on a warm day. Administrative records show fewer deliveries of aromatic goods. The incense routes from Arabia and India, once carefully maintained, began to divert toward Babylon and later Seleucia. When Alexander came to Pasargadae in 330 BCE, the tomb had been robbed of its treasures and worse, of its fragrance. According to Aristobulus, Alexander was said to have wept in silence, not for the treasure, but for the loss of something sacred in the air. He ordered the tomb restored, new guards assigned, new perfumes offered. But the original system passed from watcher to watcher, unwritten, memorized, was already dissolving. No one knew the old recipes. No one remembered when to anoint the doors, or how to infuse saffron properly with poppy oil. The air had gone still, not holy stillness but empty stillness. And that is how an empire dies, not only in battle or rebellion, but when it forgets the fragrance that once defined its soul. What if the preservation of memory is not a matter of monuments, but of how a place smells when the past is honored correctly? What if the most enduring forms of remembrance are not made of marble, but of molecules invisible, delicate, and lingering long after our words are gone? Long after the chants ended, long after the oil lamps were extinguished and the ceremonial garments folded away, the tombs of Pasargadae remained. Empty, yes, but not forgotten. The air around them, once carefully curated, now drifted scentless across the plain. The legacy of fragrance, so intricately tied to the Achaemenid concept of kingship, faded into silence, its molecular archive carried away on the wind or buried in the dry soil. But before that final stillness, there were echoes. Echoes of rituals no longer performed, of incense recipes remembered only in fragments, and of a world that once believed to bury a king without fragrance was to let memory rot. This was the twilight of scent as sovereignty. The disruption of ritual after the conquest. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he restored Cyrus's tomb, but not the system. His guards may have stood post. His orders may have seen new linens and jars placed within the chamber. But the living tradition, the ritual intelligence passed from generation to generation, was irreparably broken. Without its keepers of the air, the tomb was a chamber, not a sanctuary. And this change reflected more than just administrative failure. It marked a shift in the cosmology of death. The Achaemenids had viewed the tomb as a space of continued influence where the physical presence of the king was enhanced and stabilized through perfume, cleanliness, and air management. When that was lost, the dead were no longer active presences. They became symbols, silent, inert, disconnected. Even in Alexander's own court, fragrance remained part of royal life, but it was decadent, not structural. Perfume became personal again, not political. The idea of scent as public architecture, as atmospheric statecraft, began to dissolve. Legacy in dust and detail. Yet traces endured. In the ruins of Pasargadae and nearby Persepolis, archaeologists have recovered shards of small ceramic scent burners, some still holding blackened residue suggesting mixtures of mastic, myrrh, and date syrup. One remarkable fragment, found near what is believed to have been a garden altar, bore an Elamite inscription that reads, "To keep the memory from fatting, oil of rose, wood of cypress, bark of almond." Was this a recipe, a commandment, or a eulogy in scent? In another corner of the site, remnants of reed trays were discovered, woven tight and stained with an oily residue. These may have been used in the air-lifting ritual where fragrance-soaked cloth was laid in the sun to perfume the surrounding garden. It was part of the seasonal cycle that had, for a time, kept the tomb in conversation with the living world. There are no written records of this ritual in full, only its afterimage in ruined objects and weathered stones. The tomb without a voice. Centuries passed. The Achaemenid Empire gave way to the Seleucids, then to the Parthians, and finally to the Sasanian dynasty. In each transition, the tomb at Pasargadae lost a little more of its meaning. The new regimes favored new capitals, new rituals, and the tomb, without its perfume, became just a ruin among many. Travelers came and went. Nomads pitched tents nearby. Dust settled inside the empty chamber, and the smell that once defined power, legitimacy, mourning, and balance never returned. The only fragrances now were those of nature: dry earth, cracked grass, wind-borne saffron fields in the far distance. The carefully engineered olfactory theater of kingship had disappeared into the broader landscape. And yet the tomb still stands. The wind still moves across the steps. And sometimes, perhaps, if one stands still at the right time of year just after the rains, just before the heat, one might imagine the air not as empty, but as once full. Full of intention, full of continuity, full of unseen presence. Lessons from scented stone. In the modern world, we often think of memory in visual terms: monuments, portraits, documents. But the Achaemenids understood that memory lives in the body, and that scent is the most intimate of all senses. It bypasses reason, it resists forgetting, it reanimates the past not through logic but through feeling. Pasargadae's perfumed tombs were not simply decorative. They were part of a sophisticated state technology. By embedding scent into stone, ritual, and law, the empire used the invisible to reinforce what was visible. It teaches us something simple but powerful: that the health of memory requires maintenance, that even empires must be aired out, that when rituals of remembrance collapse, so too does the coherence of the past. In the end, the fall of the Achaemenid tombs was not just the fall of structures, it was the failure to preserve the air within them. And that is a loss harder to measure than toppled stones. A final breath. Today, Pasargadae is quiet. The tourists who visit walk among ruins, unaware that once centuries ago the place was alive with scent. That here, death was not a static state, but a choreography of fragrance performed to affirm continuity. No incense burns now. No oil warms in carved basins. But beneath the limestone steps, in the memory of air once tended by watchful hands, the echo of perfume remains. And we are left to wonder. If you were buried without your scent, your atmosphere, your signature, would you be remembered at all? Story 6. The Amber Road of Empire Resins, Caravans, and the Scented Spine of the Achaemenid World. It is easy to imagine ancient empires as solid things: walls of stone, soldiers in formation, kings on thrones. But more often, they were networks of breath and distance, shaped by what moved people, goods, ideas, and, surprisingly often, scent. Among the least remembered but most essential arteries of the Persian Empire was the so-called Amber Road, a loosely connected set of caravan routes that wound through forests, deserts, and mountain passes, carrying not just the fossilized resin from trees in the north, but a whole world of olfactory materials: incense, spices, oils, gums, perfumes. The Achaemenid world thrived not only on gold and tribute, but on the commerce of scent, and the roads that made such trade possible formed the scented spine of the empire. This is the story of that road. What was the Amber Road? Despite the romantic name, there was no single road paved with amber or lined with trees weeping golden sap. Instead, Amber Road, refers to a series of ancient trade routes used to transport succinate, or true amber fossilized resin from coniferous trees, particularly from the Baltic region southward into the heartlands of the Achaemenid Empire. But amber was just the beginning. The same paths that carried amber also moved. Labdanum from Crete, frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from the Horn of Africa, benzoin and storax from Anatolia, turpentine and pine, resin from Armenia, and various oils and unguents from Bactria and beyond. These routes crossed through territories controlled by the Achaemenid kings or their vassals, creating an imperial network that, while not always formalized, was closely monitored and at times heavily taxed. The result was a kind of aromatic bloodstream, circulating scent-based goods across a territory that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Why scent mattered? Scent was not a luxury in the Persian world, it was a necessity. In Zoroastrian religious practice, fire temples relied on clean-burning resins like frankincense and storax to maintain ritual purity. The corpse-watching towers and funeral rites demanded high volumes of preservative aromatics. Court ceremonies were judged by the fragrance in the air, and palace storage rooms were filled not only with grain and gold, but with jars of oil and scented pastes. Administrative tablets from Susa and Persepolis even record quotas of aromatic resins alongside standard rations. 5 minas myrrh to priest of fire temple, 2 minas frankincense to burial stewards, 3 jars cedar oil to royal guard for use in chambers. Aromatic materials were embedded in governance, religion, diplomacy, and medicine. Without a steady stream of scent-bearing goods, the machinery of the empire, at least symbolically, began to fray. Caravans, the slow pulse of empire. These goods did not move quickly. Amber, for instance, might take a full year to reach the southern satrapies of Persia. Starting from the coasts of the Baltic Sea, what is today Lithuania or Poland, it would pass through Slavic forests, across Scythian grasslands, through Transcaucasia, and down into the Zagros Mountains. It traveled in pieces wrapped in wool, sealed in wax pouches to preserve its scent. Merchants moved slowly, often no more than 20-30 kilometers a day. They traveled with mule trains or camel caravans, depending on terrain. Licenses or tokens, provided by satrapal authorities. Scribes who kept track of cargo, tolls, and losses. Resin testers, experts who could verify quality and origin of aromatic goods. These caravans were, in a way, mobile rituals. When they arrived in a major city, Susa, Ecbatana, Persepolis, it was a scented event, something that stirred attention even before it was seen. Smell precedes the merchant, one Babylonian proverb warned, but hides behind the taxman. Storage and surveillance. In the heart of the empire, imperial depots were established to house and distribute aromatic goods. These were highly specialized facilities, usually adjacent to temples or royal compounds. Their key features included clay amphorae with wax seals, used to store resins, cedarwood racks, preferred for their antifungal properties, ledger walls with symbols etched to show the quantity, scent type, and intended use, cool, dark chambers, often underground or shaded, to preserve potency. Guards were assigned not merely to protect the goods, but to protect the recipes. Many of these scents were blended at court, and each blend had ritual meaning. For example, one preparation used for temple cleansing consisted of 4 parts labdanum, 3 parts myrrh, 1 part saffron oil, a half part powdered amber. These combinations were considered proprietary. Some were reserved only for the eyes and noses of the magi, the priestly class of Zoroastrianism. To leak a scent was, in some contexts, a form of treason. Amber, the sacred fossil. Among all these goods, amber held a particularly mystical position. Though not as fragrant as resins like frankincense or benzoin, amber was prized for its warming aroma when rubbed or gently heated, its use as a base note in incense blends, its perceived protective properties, especially when worn as amulets, its connection to northern mystery, a substance from lands the Persians did not fully control. Amber was burned in low ceremonies, daily offerings, household rites, and even military pre-battle prayers. Soldiers often carried small beads of it, believing it could ward off poison and madness. Amber in Persian was sometimes called ashkai dereket, or tree's tear, a name both beautiful and sorrowful. And that perhaps speaks to its power, the relic of a wound carried from one end of the world to the other, to fill the air with something that says, "Even trees weep, and their grief can protect us." A network that disappeared. Today, few traces of the Amber Road remain. Unlike the Silk Road or the Royal Road, which left ruins of way stations, markers, and cities in their wake, the paths used to transport scent were largely informal, reliant on temporary arrangements, personal trust, and oral navigation. Their paths shifted with political winds. A war in Armenia might divert caravans through Bactria. A border dispute in Scythia could shut down northern trade for years. A plague might cause towns to burn their entire perfume stock for fear of miasma. And so, as the empire eventually fractured, the scented roots dissolved too. But for a few centuries, this network held the empire's breath, a subtle but powerful infrastructure of memory, meaning, and movement. The scent of a place is harder to reconstruct than its walls or coins, and yet it tells us more about how that place felt, what was valued, what was feared, what was sacred. So as you walk the ruins of the Achaemenid world in your mind, ask yourself, what scents once guided the empire's pulse, and where did they go when the roads fell silent? The power of empire rarely rests in what can be seen. Walls, armies, and coinage matter, of course, but so too do whispers, habits, and things that vanish into the air. In the Achaemenid world, scent was influence, and influence had to be managed. That meant controlling not only the flow of aromatic goods through trade and ritual, but also through regulation, inspection, taxation, and inevitably subversion. The Amber Road and its aromatic tributaries were not always smooth lanes of imperial bounty. They were contested, rerouted, and often undermined by those who knew the real value of scent went beyond temples and thrones. This is the story of the underworld of perfume, the temples that trafficked in tar, and the caravaneers who carried smoke as both blessing and contraband. The scent smugglers of Cilicia. In the southern reaches of Anatolia, nestled between rough hills and coastal cliffs, lay Cilicia, a territory nominally loyal to the Achaemenid crown but known for its unpredictable governors and shadow markets. Here, among the lesser-used trails of the Amber Road, scent smuggling flourished. The targets were specific. Myrrh, tightly controlled by priestly orders, valuable for burials. Labdanum, used in royal perfumery, derived from the beards of goats grazing on rock rows. Storax, a resin used in ritual fumigation, hard to distinguish in small quantities. Amber, not smuggled in bulk, but shaved into powder and hidden in wax or bread. Smugglers disguised their goods in creative ways. Resin balls hidden in dried gourds, marked as food supplies. Amber dust pressed into the glue of wagon wheels. Oils soaked into priestly robes, which were then wrung out at destination markets. They bribed low-level guards, used coded incense markers to identify one another, and kept their caravans small, never large enough to draw official attention, yet just profitable enough to maintain the risk. Some even posed as pilgrims, carrying small censers and claiming to be on their way to temple rituals. No one inspects the smoke of a holy man, one fragment reads. Temples as hubs of scent power. Yet ironically, Many of these smuggling networks originated within temples themselves. Zoroastrian fire temples, Babylonian shrines, and even Phoenician coastal sanctuaries maintained their own incense operations, partly religious, partly economic. The reasons were complex. Temples needed a constant supply of incense to fulfill daily rites. Many priests were trained in botany and perfumery, understanding the chemistry of blends. Offerings often included aromatic gifts, which could be repackaged or redistributed. Some temples received imperial exemptions, allowing them to trade without tax. This created a gray market where religious institutions operated as both spiritual centers and aromatic exchanges. One scroll from a Sidonian temple lists 2 amphorae labdanum, 3 bags of frankincense, half measure of styrax, exchanged for 6 amphorae barley and 1 mule. Such trades were not illegal, but deeply political. A temple that controlled incense flows could exert subtle influence over governors, satraps, and even royal emissaries. To receive the correct scent at the right moment, a funerary blend for a queen, a battlefield fumigation for an army, was to receive a gesture of favor or divine alignment. To be denied a shipment, that was a quiet act of resistance. Resins and rebellions. Fragrance, then, could be subversive. When revolts simmered across the empire, especially in regions like Egypt, Ionia, or Bactria, one of the first signs was often a disruption in scent supply chains. In Egypt, priests in Thebes withheld shipments of kaifi, a sacred perfume of 23 ingredients, claiming ritual impurity. The real reason: defiance against Persian rule. In Ionia, scribes recorded the sudden appearance of foreign incense at local altars, a sign that unapproved merchants were selling resins directly to temples, bypassing imperial channels. And in Bactria, certain governors were accused of redirecting cedar oil shipments meant for royal use to local nobles instead, consolidating power in their own courts. This may seem minor, but in a world where scent validated power, to control its flow was to reshape loyalty. As the old saying went, "The fire that burns with foreign resin cannot speak the king's name." The rise of private perfumers. Alongside smugglers and temples, a third force emerged in the world of scent: the private perfumers. Initially artisans serving royal households, by the later Achaemenid period, they had begun to operate independently, catering to wealthy elites, minor nobles, and ambitious merchants. These perfumers developed signature blends, often tied to family lines, passed down formulas in coded ledgers, using symbols for ingredients, traveled with guarded caravans, escorted by hired muscle, operated pop-up stalls at festivals, using burning platforms to advertise scent samples. One notable figure was Tazita of Sardis, a woman known for her oil-based perfumes infused with rare saffron and essence of pistachio resin. Her products were said to be fit for queens and thieves alike. The crown viewed such independence with suspicion. Official records show attempts to license or tax private scent makers, but enforcement was spotty. In some cases, perfumers became spies, smuggling messages in sealed scent jars or identifying political sympathies by tracking who purchased which incense. It was said that the smell of someone's chamber could tell you more than their scrolls. The invisible wars of scent. By the time of Darius III, on the eve of Alexander's conquest, the Persian Empire was as much a battlefield of aromatic politics as it was of swords. In cities like Susa, competing scent profiles began to emerge. Royal blend, cedar, labdanum, amber, and rose. Temple blend, frankincense, cinnamon, storax. Popular blend, myrrh, clove, and sweet calamus from India. To smell like the court was to signal loyalty. To burn a foreign scent was to suggest sympathy with rebels or outsiders. Scent, once the air of empire, was becoming a language of identity fractured, contested, and in some cases deliberately weaponized. What does it mean when the air itself becomes political? When the scent of your funeral pyre, your bedroom, or your garden speaks for or against the state? And when that system breaks, as all systems do, what remains in the air? There is a moment, just before a system dies, when its collapse can be smelled before it is seen. In the late Achaemenid world, as Alexander's armies closed in, as regional satraps began to defect or consolidate local power, and as trust in central control withered, the empire's air changed. Not metaphorically, but literally. Scent, once the symbol of unity, ritual, and divine proximity, became inconsistent. In palace halls once perfumed with cedar and amber, the air grew still. Incense arrived late or not at all. Temples fumbled with substitutions. Funeral rites were performed with lesser resins or skipped entirely. Perfume artisans fled or went silent. The amber road, that ancient invisible highway of scent and meaning, was no longer reliable. And what followed was not just political collapse, but a kind of olfactory silence. The final fragrances of Persepolis. Persepolis, once the jewel of the empire, offers an eerie case study in this slow evaporation of air. In its final years under Darius III, scent records still appear on surviving tablets, resins allocated, oils blended, jars transported. But they begin to shrink in quantity, shift in composition, or appear in unusual contexts. One tablet lists 1 jar storax diluted, 1/2 amphora cedar oil stored in clay unscented. Another, myrrh substitute accepted, bitter gum mixed with honey and rose water. This wasn't just about budget cuts or scarcity. It was about losing control of the symbolic order. Rituals had formulas, and formulas had meaning. To dilute or deviate was to risk religious and political imbalance. By the time Alexander's army sacked the city in 330 BCE, many of the storerooms had already been cleared of their finest resins and oils, either used in desperate rites, sold off for bribes, or hidden away. And then came the fire. Ashen oil, the burning of empire. Much has been written about Alexander's torching of Persepolis, a fire that may have been intentional vengeance for the Persian sack of Athens, or perhaps a drunken act during celebration. Whatever the cause, the result was the same, an olfactory apocalypse. Ancient eyewitnesses, often Greek, describe it not just in visuals, but in smell. The air choked with burning gum and wax, and the smoke was sweet and terrible. Fragment attributed to Callisthenes, court historian. The materials that had filled temples and chambers, frankincense, myrrh, cedar oil, storax, ignited with intensity. These were not dry woods or fragile scrolls. They were flammable, oily, dense with volatile aroma. The city for a moment became incense, a sacrificial pyre for an entire world order. And just as quickly it was gone. After the collapse, what remains in the air? With Alexander's conquest, the Amber Road lost its political spine. Trade continued, of course amber still moved. Oils were still blended, but the infrastructure that had once made it a matter of state survival disappeared. Gone were they. Licensed caravans under royal seal. Temple-backed blending quotas. Sent tribute lists from satrapies. Religious restrictions on blend compositions. In their place came a more fragmented, commodified world of scent. Hellenistic rulers embraced perfume but treated it as luxury, not liturgy. Incense was used in showy processions, not sacred ceremonies. Amber became an ornament, not a ritual item. A system where scent had meaning gave way to one where scent was accessory. And the old meanings about sovereignty, identity, and memory slowly drifted away. The memory in resin. And yet fragments endure. Amber beads found in Bactrian graves. scent jars buried with priests in Anatolia, scorched storax resin beneath the charred floor of a fire temple near Susa. Even now, archaeologists in Iran, Armenia, and Turkmenistan sometimes detect traces of ancient aroma when excavating sealed jars, resinous ghosts, microscopic memory. And in modern Zoroastrian rituals, though simplified and distant from their Achaemenid origins, the use of sacred fire and aromatic wood remains, a whisper of that scented empire. We are reminded that air, like empire, can be shaped, and that when it changes everything. Lessons from a forgotten road. So what did the Amber Road teach us? That empires are held together not just by stone, or sword, or gold, but by scent. That the invisible carries power. That ritual consistency can define legitimacy. And that when the air breaks, so too does belief. In the end, the Amber Road was not just a trade route. It was a philosophy of governance, trust, and memory. It was quite literally the breath of empire. But consider this. What if all roads begin with a scent? And what if, long after we forget their names or routes, the only proof they ever existed is what still lingers in the air?